When we talk about the 2026 Iran war, we have to let go of an outdated idea, the idea that war happens only on a physical battlefield with soldiers, tanks, and aircraft. That picture is no longer complete. What we witnessed was something far more sophisticated, far more subtle, and in many ways far more powerful. War has evolved into something that operates in layers, and one of the most decisive of those layers is invisible. Cyber warfare, in this context, was not a supporting act. It was not something happening in the background while the real war took place elsewhere. It was embedded into the very fabric of military strategy. Before a single missile was launched or a jet crossed into contested airspace, digital operations had already begun shaping the outcome. Think about what that really means. Imagine an opponent whose communication systems suddenly become unreliable. Commands are delayed, radar feeds are distorted. Surveillance systems go dark, or worse, begin feeding false information. In that moment, confusion replaces clarity. And in warfare, confusion is not just a weakness, it is an opening. This is where cyber warfare demonstrates its true power. It doesn't just destroy, it disorients. It doesn't only break systems, it breaks trust in those systems. And once trust is broken, every decision becomes slower, heavier, and filled with doubt. In the 2026 conflict, coordinated cyber operations were used to disrupt command and control networks at critical moments. These weren't random attacks. They were timed, calculated, and synchronized with physical military actions. The result was a kind of strategic choreography, where digital strikes softened the battlefield before any visible engagement occurred. Now let's step back and look at the deeper implication. For centuries, military advantage depended on physical strength, numbers, weapons, geography. But here, we see a shift toward cognitive dominance. The side that can control information, manipulate perception, and disrupt decision-making gains the upper hand before the first shot is even fired. This changes the psychology of war, because now the battlefield is not just land or airspace, it is the human mind. It is the decision-making process inside a command center. It is the confidence a leader has in the data they are receiving. Cyber warfare targets that space directly. It creates hesitation. It introduces doubt, and in high-stakes environments, even a few seconds of hesitation can change the course of events. There's also a philosophical dimension to this transformation. We are moving from a world where power is measured by what you can physically control to a world where power is measured by what you can influence without being seen. That's a profound shift. It raises questions not just about strategy, but about reality itself. If a radar system shows something that isn't there, what is real? If communication lines are compromised, what information can be trusted? And if decisions are made based on manipulated data, who is truly in control? This is the essence of integrated cyber warfare. It blurs the line between action and perception, between reality and illusion. And in doing so, it forces us to rethink what it means to have an advantage in conflict. But here's where it becomes even more significant. This integration doesn't just affect military leaders. It affects entire societies. When digital systems are targeted, the ripple effects extend beyond the battlefield. Infrastructure, communication networks, and even everyday technologies become part of the conflict environment. The line between military and civilian space begins to dissolve. And that brings us to a critical realization. In modern warfare, no one is completely outside the battlefield anymore. Now I want you to consider what this means for the future. If wars are increasingly decided by who can disrupt, deceive, and dominate in the digital space, then the nature of preparedness must also change. It's no longer enough to invest only in physical defense. Nations, organizations, and even individuals must think in terms of resilience of systems, of information, and of mindset. Because at its core, cyber warfare is a contest of awareness. The side that understands the environment more deeply, that anticipates disruption, and that adapts faster, will always have the edge. And that's not just a military lesson, that's a life lesson. We are living in a time where information shapes reality, where perception can be engineered, where what you believe to be true can be influenced without your awareness. And in that kind of world, your greatest strength is not just knowledge, it is discernment. The ability to question, to verify, to think critically, that becomes your defense system. So when we reflect on the role of cyber warfare in this conflict, we are not just analyzing a military tactic. We are witnessing a shift in how power operates in the modern world. A shift from visible force to invisible influence, from direct confrontation to strategic disruption. And if there is one thing to take away from this, it is this: the wars of the future will not begin with explosions. They will begin with confusion. And the side that learns to see clearly in the midst of that confusion will be the one that ultimately prevails. Now, once we understand that cyber warfare is fully integrated into the battlefield, the next realization becomes even more unsettling, because the question is no longer whether systems will be targeted. The question is which systems, and more importantly, whose lives those systems are connected to. In the 2026 Iran war, cyber attacks did not limit themselves to military installations or classified networks. They reached far deeper, into the very infrastructure that holds everyday life together. Banks, telecommunications, transportation systems, digital platforms, these became targets. Not as accidents, not as side effects, but as deliberate points of pressure. And that tells us something critical about the evolution of conflict. War is no longer confined to soldiers. It has expanded into the routines of ordinary people. When a banking system is disrupted, it's not just numbers on a screen that are affected, it's access to food, to medicine, to stability. When communication networks are compromised, it's not just data that disappears, it's the ability of families to connect, of communities to organize, of leaders to reassure. This is where cyber warfare reveals its deeper strategy. It is not only about disabling systems, it is about destabilizing societies. Because think about it, what happens when people cannot access their money? What happens when messages don't go through, when news cannot be verified, when systems people depend on suddenly become unreliable? There is a psychological shift that takes place. Anxiety rises, trust erodes, and in that environment, uncertainty becomes a weapon. The tools used in these attacks, wiper malware, distributed denial of service attacks, data corruption, are technical by design, but their impact is profoundly human. They create disruption not just in machines, but in minds. They force people to question the stability of the systems they once took for granted. And that's where the real power lies. Because a society that loses confidence in its infrastructure begins to fracture from within. People start to operate from fear rather than reason. Decisions become reactive instead of strategic. And in that state, the effectiveness of traditional defense measures begins to decline. Now, let's take this a step further. Historically, there was a distinction between military targets and civilian spaces. That distinction served as both a legal boundary and a moral one. But in the digital age, that boundary is becoming increasingly blurred. Why? Because the same networks that support civilian life are often intertwined with national security systems. The same technologies that enable convenience also create vulnerability. And so, when cyber attacks occur, they do not always respect those old divisions. This raises an important philosophical question. If the infrastructure of daily life becomes part of the battlefield, what does it mean to be a civilian in modern conflict? It means that participation is no longer a choice. It means that exposure is built into the system. And it means that resilience is no longer just a government responsibility. It is a shared one. Because here's the truth. The more connected we become, the more interdependent our systems are, the more attractive they become as targets. Connectivity brings efficiency, but it also brings risk. And cyber warfare exploits that risk with precision. But there's another layer to this that we cannot ignore. These attacks are not always about immediate destruction. Sometimes they are about sending a message. A disruption in a financial system can signal economic vulnerability. A breach in communication networks can signal a loss of control. These are not just technical events. They are strategic signals designed to influence behavior, both domestically and internationally. And when those signals are received, they shape perception. They influence how a nation is viewed, how stable it appears, how capable it seems. In that sense, cyber attacks on infrastructure are not just operational, they are symbolic. They communicate power. So what does all of this mean for us, beyond the context of war? It means we need to rethink how we define security. Security is no longer just about borders and defenses. It's about systems, networks, and the trust that binds them together. It's about ensuring that the structures we rely on are not only efficient, but resilient. And resilience in this context is not just about preventing attacks. It's about the ability to absorb disruption, to adapt under pressure, and to recover quickly. It's about building systems that do not collapse at the first sign of stress, but instead continue to function, even in degraded conditions. But beyond systems, there is a human dimension to resilience. It is about awareness. It is about understanding that the conveniences we enjoy come with responsibilities. It is about recognizing that in a connected world, security is not something we can take for granted. It is something we must actively engage with. Because at the end of the day, cyber warfare is not just targeting machines. It is targeting the assumptions we make about stability, reliability, and control. And if we are not conscious of those assumptions, we become vulnerable, not just technologically, but psychologically. So as you reflect on this, I want you to consider the systems you rely on every day, the networks you trust without question, the structures that make your life function smoothly. Now imagine them disrupted, not destroyed, just uncertain, because that's where the real impact lies. And here is the truth you must carry forward. The strongest societies are not the ones that never face disruption. They are the ones that remain steady when disruption comes. And once the infrastructure is shaken, once systems begin to feel uncertain, there is another layer that comes into play, one that doesn't attack machines directly, but something far more influential. It targets perception, it targets belief. It targets the story people tell themselves about what is happening. This is where information warfare steps forward, not as a side tactic, but as a central force shaping the outcome of conflict. Because let's be clear, human beings do not act based on reality alone. We act based on our interpretation of reality. And if that interpretation can be influenced, redirected, or distorted, then behavior itself can be guided without ever firing a shot. In the 2026 Iran war, information operations became highly sophisticated, deeply strategic, and in many cases powered by artificial intelligence. We saw the rise of AI-generated content, videos, audio, images that blurred the line between what is real and what is fabricated. Not crude attempts at deception, but highly convincing simulations designed to bypass skepticism and tap directly into emotion. Now think about the psychological weight of that. If you cannot trust what you see, if you cannot rely on what you hear, then where do you anchor your understanding? The very foundation of perception begins to shift. And in that space of uncertainty, influence becomes easier because confusion creates openness. And openness without discernment creates vulnerability. Social media platforms became battlegrounds in their own right. Narratives were crafted, amplified, and strategically deployed. Messages were not just broadcast, they were targeted. Different audiences received different versions of the same event, each designed to trigger a specific emotional response. Fear, anger, pride, doubt. These became tools of engagement. And here's where it becomes even more profound. Information warfare is not just about spreading falsehoods. It is about shaping context. It is about deciding which truths are highlighted, which are ignored, and how events are framed. Because the way a story is told often matters more than the facts themselves. And when artificial intelligence enters that space, the scale and speed of influence increase dramatically. Content can be generated, tested, and distributed in real time. Narratives can evolve based on audience reaction. What resonates is reinforced. What doesn't is replaced. It becomes a dynamic system of psychological engagement. This is no longer propaganda in the traditional sense. This is adaptive influence. Now, let's pause and reflect on what that means. It means that the battlefield is not just out there. It is within the information environment we all participate in. Every scroll, every share, every reaction becomes part of a larger ecosystem where narratives compete for dominance. And in that ecosystem, attention becomes currency. The more attention a piece of content receives, the more power it gains. Not necessarily because it is true, but because it is seen, felt, and shared. And that creates a feedback loop where emotionally charged content rises to the surface, often faster than rational analysis can keep up. This has a direct impact on public opinion. It shapes how people perceive the conflict, how they assign blame, how they define justice. And those perceptions in turn influence political decisions, international relations, and even the morale of populations. So in a very real sense, information warfare extends the battlefield into the collective consciousness of society. But there is also a deeper philosophical layer here. We are entering an era where the distinction between truth and narrative is becoming increasingly complex, not because truth no longer exists, but because access to it is mediated through systems that can be influenced. And that raises a critical question. How do we maintain clarity in an environment designed to create confusion? The answer is not simple, but it begins with awareness. It begins with recognizing that not all information is neutral, that not all content is created with the intention to inform. Some of it is designed to persuade, to provoke, to manipulate. And once you understand that, you begin to engage differently. You pause, you question, you look beyond the surface. Because in the age of information warfare, critical thinking is not just an intellectual skill, it is a form of defense. Now, I want to bring this back to the human level, because behind every algorithm, behind every campaign, there is a simple objective: to influence how you feel, and through that, how you act. If fear dominates, people withdraw or react impulsively. If anger dominates, conflict escalates. If confusion dominates, direction is lost. But if clarity is maintained, if individuals remain grounded in thoughtful analysis, then the power of manipulation begins to weaken, and that is where responsibility comes in. Not just at the level of governments or institutions, but at the level of individuals. Each person who engages with information has a role to play in either amplifying distortion or reinforcing clarity. So the question becomes personal. How do you respond to what you see? Do you react immediately or do you reflect? Do you share impulsively or do you verify? Do you allow emotion to guide your understanding or do you balance it with reason? Because those small decisions, repeated across millions of individuals, shape the information landscape as a whole. And in that sense, the outcome of information warfare is not determined solely by those who create the messages, but also by those who receive them. So as you think about this dimension of the conflict, don't just see it as something happening at a distance. Recognize your place within it. Recognize your agency. Because in a world where perception can be engineered, the ability to think clearly becomes a powerful act. And here is the truth I want you to carry with you. In the age of information warfare, the greatest victory is not controlling what people see. It is empowering them to see for themselves. And just when you think you understand the structure of this new kind of warfare, states using cyber tools, institutions defending networks, systems pushing against systems, something else enters the picture that changes it all again, something less predictable, less centralized, and in many ways more disruptive. Because in the 2026 Iran war, it was not only governments operating in the digital space, it was also individuals, loosely organized groups, and ideologically driven collectives, what we often call hacktivists. And their presence introduces a new reality. Cyber conflict is no longer controlled solely by nation states. Now think about that for a moment. For most of history, war has been defined by structure. There were clear actors, clear chains of command, clear boundaries of responsibility. But in the cyber domain, those lines begin to dissolve. A group operating from one part of the world can influence events in another without ever crossing a border, without ever revealing their identity. And that changes the nature of power, because power is no longer just about resources or territory. It's about access, skill, and intent. A small group with the right capabilities can disrupt systems, leak sensitive information, or amplify narratives in ways that rival state-level operations. In the 2026 conflict, dozens of these groups align themselves, either openly or indirectly, with one side or another. Some were motivated by ideology, others by nationalism, others simply by the desire to be part of something larger than themselves. But regardless of motivation, their actions contributed to the overall intensity and complexity of the conflict. This creates a kind of digital ecosystem of conflict, decentralized, fluid, and constantly evolving. Now, here's where it becomes even more significant. These actors do not operate under the same constraints as governments. They are not bound by formal rules of engagement. They are not accountable in the traditional sense. And because of that, they can act more aggressively, more unpredictably, and sometimes more recklessly. This introduces a layer of volatility that is difficult to manage. Because when actions are taken without clear attribution, responses become complicated. If a cyber attack originates from a non-state group but appears to be linked to a nation, how should that nation respond? Do they retaliate? Do they hold back? Do they risk escalation based on incomplete information? You begin to see how quickly uncertainty can spiral. And this is what we mean when we say cyber warfare is global and borderless. It is not confined by geography. It is not limited by time zones. It moves across networks, across continents, across jurisdictions, often faster than policies and defenses can adapt. A disruption in one region can have ripple effects across the world. Financial systems, supply chains, communication platforms, these are interconnected on a global scale. And when they are targeted, the impact does not stay local. This interconnectedness is both a strength and a vulnerability. It allows for efficiency, for collaboration, for rapid exchange of information. But it also means that a weakness in one part of the system can be exploited to affect the whole. And in a cyber conflict, those weaknesses are constantly being tested. Now, let's step back and look at the deeper implication of this shift. We are moving from a model of conflict that is hierarchical and controlled to one that is networked and emergent. In a hierarchical system, you can identify leaders, predict actions, establish deterrence. But in a network system, behavior emerges from the interaction of many independent actors, and that makes it harder to predict, harder to contain, harder to resolve. This also changes the role of responsibility. In traditional warfare, responsibility is assigned to states. But in a decentralized cyber environment, responsibility becomes diffuse. It spreads across individuals, groups, platforms, and even the technologies themselves. And that raises an important question. Who is accountable in a world where anyone can be a participant? It's not an easy question to answer, but it is a necessary one to ask, because without clarity on responsibility, the risk of escalation increases. Misinterpretation becomes more likely, and the potential for unintended consequences grows. But there is also an opportunity here, if we are willing to see it. A decentralized environment does not only create risk, it also creates the possibility for collective resilience. Just as individuals and groups can contribute to disruption, they can also contribute to defense. They can share knowledge, strengthen systems, raise awareness, and support stability. In other words, the same network that enables conflict can also enable cooperation. And that brings us back to the human element, because at the center of all this technology, all these systems, all these networks are people making decisions, people choosing how to act, how to respond, how to engage. The tools may be digital, but the intentions are human. So the question becomes not just what kind of systems we build, but what kind of mindset we bring to those systems. Do we approach them with responsibility, with awareness, with a sense of collective impact? Or do we engage without considering the consequences? Because in a connected world, actions rarely stay isolated. They ripple outward. And those ripples can either destabilize or strengthen the environment we all share. So as you reflect on this final dimension of cyber warfare, I want you to see it not just as a technological evolution, but as a shift in how we understand participation, responsibility, and power itself. Because the truth is, the battlefield has expanded. It is no longer defined by borders or uniforms. It is defined by access, by connection, by influence. And in that kind of world, every node in the network matters. Every action counts. Every choice contributes. So here is the thought I want to leave you with. In a borderless war, neutrality is an illusion, because the moment you connect, you become part of the system. The only real question is whether your presence strengthens it or weakens it.